And good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Most Important Conversations Daily Meditations. We run these meditations Monday through Friday, and the meditation theme, the macro theme across all of these meditations is liberation. The Most Important Conversations Daily Meditation. Each day that we have these meditations, we have a talk before we actually start the meditation, and the content from the talks is derived from our program Whole Life Architecture, which is a live interactive community where participants are actively creating their life by design, no longer willing to merely tolerate a life by default. The participants are connecting to the creator within, to their power to actually decondition themselves, liberate themselves, or as I've been saying recently, undevelop themselves. We have an overdeveloped culture, an overly conditioned culture, where people are obsessed with self-help and personal development as opposed to going within and connecting to the source essence of who they are, and no longer trying to conform to some way of living or way of being that is acceptable by the society. And so for those of you interested in learning more about that, you can go to tmicglobal.com and look at Whole Life Architecture. Yesterday I was talking about the importance of context. This is something we deal a lot with inside of Whole Life Architecture because it is one of the foundational principles that helps us actually not only understand why our life occurs the way it currently does to us, but also understanding that by shifting context, we can transform our life. Now, to shift the context means that we're going to need to liberate ourselves because we can get addicted and attached to context like we can and do get addicted and attached to pretty much anything because our brain is an addiction-making machine. As I was saying yesterday, for 80 years, we have been conditioned to be human doings instead of human beings. A human doing is someone whose belief in themselves, whose value to society, and whose identity is defined by what they do, not who they are as a being. And there's an enormous amount of conditioning around this. And our conditioning around doing is so deep that for many of us, we become totally detached to who we actually are as a being. In our current noisy context of unprecedented change, speaking about context again, whether that's the result of artificial intelligence or robotics or the collapse of globalization, the stresses on our ecosystem upon which we depend not only to survive, but ultimately and ideally we would like to thrive, that we're caught beneath this or between this denial and political expediency where we're avoiding the unknown that we face and grasping for certainty in our past, which we tend to do as human beings, which is why the past repeats itself, history repeats itself. And we're in this situation right now where the context of our society and the context of how we're living our individual lives are so rooted in a system that is opposed to our thriving that it's a very strange place for each of us on an individual level, even within our own lives, to be. And so understanding that the context of our individual life and the context of our society is another way of saying it's like our operating system. The context is that invisible structure that we are in reaction to, and we don't see it, and we're not present to it, but it's just always there, and it is actually creating the conditions, or the context creates the conditions in which we are in reaction to. So it's that underlying operating system in our individual life and or in the culture. We have a context within our individual life that's unique and specific to us, but is also connected to the wider context or operating system in the culture, in the society. This is why change is so difficult. And at a moment where we're experiencing exponential and unprecedented change from the outside in, literally the context of the culture is changing now because of AI and robotics and the collapse of globalization and all the things I just mentioned. And that's rubbing up against the context of our individual life. So as an individual, we assume each day that the context and how things show up are going to somewhat, or for the most part, mirror or resemble the next day. And yet every day, I would say probably for the last 6 or so years, we have been hit with a new crack in the wider cultural context. We went through a pandemic. We've had geopolitical strife with various wars showing up. That's disrupted the context of stability and reliability that the markets need. This is impacting, if you're an investor, investments. It's impacting the workforce. If you're an employee, it's impacting the perception of stability that companies need in order to make decisions and have a sense that they can predict, although they never can, despite what they believe, have a sense that they can predict what the future might hold and upon which they make decisions. And then we've gone through, in addition to all of these wars, now we're introducing artificial intelligence and robotics and the disruption that's bringing to society. So the cultural and societal context is under enormous stress and going through profound, exponential, possibly existential change depending on our choices. And that is rubbing up against our individual life context, around which, again, because it's the operating system, most of us are not present to what that is. So if there was ever a time to start to look within and to do work to be the creator of a new context for yourself, as opposed to just trying to figure out the one you've been in, the operating system you've been in, and make changes to that, there's a certain amount of letting go and just saying, I'm going to start fresh and create a new context today for myself that is powerful. You could get into an analysis paralysis situation and try to understand the context that has brought you to this place, the underlying assumptions, the belief systems, the family cultural dynamics that are at work under the surface. Indeed, your very psychology is part of the context, the soup in which you're swimming, the water in which you're swimming. You could spend a lot of time trying to understand that, and in some cases, there is relevance in doing that. But imagine you have all of the answers, even if you don't know what those answers are. Imagine you get to that place, because we've all been to a place where we're seeking clarity before we can act. Imagine you've got to that place of clarity, and what would you do next? Well, you would rest in the knowing of, well, I know why that happened in my life now, and then you would move on. Because if it's in the past, likely there's not much you can do about changing any of it or bringing any kind of restitution anyway. Things that have been done are done. People that did them maybe or maybe are not still within your circle of influence and in your life. But even if they are, is it worth drudging up the past with them? Sometimes we need completion with people. That I understand and agree with. But most times, we have the ability to move forward as an act of our own creativity and start to create something new possible for our life without needing to drudge up the past. So the invitation this morning, as we move into our Watcher Observer meditation, is to consider where in your life you are beholden to your past, where in your life you are trapped with a sense of not having resolution around something that is keeping you from moving forward, where in your life is the context of the past becoming a roadblock to the path into your future. The context is the thing we are always in reaction to. And for most of us at an individual level, our context is heavily rooted in identity and in stories and narratives about what's happened to us in the past. And it's creating an immobile state for us where we can't seem to move into the future. We know that the context of the culture is changing, and there's very little we can individually, at an individual level, do about that except pivot and respond to it in the best way that we can. But the context of our own individual life is something that we have total control over. We can choose at any time to forgive. We can choose at any time to let go. We can choose at any time to drop the story. You know, it's been said that when we have what we would refer to in our culture as a negative emotion in whole life architecture and in our emotional sobriety work, which is part of whole life architecture, we teach that there's no such thing as a negative or a positive emotion. There's just emotions. And our emotions are part of a wisdom state that is trying to guide us. It is a source of wisdom in our individual and personal life. So there's no negative or positive emotions, but we relate to certain things as negative emotions. And we could choose as part of the context as part of recreating our context, as part of being the creator of our context, to not dwell in those so-called negative emotions. Sometimes there's things that we should do to resolve them, but more often than not, when we have this thing called a negative emotion, scientists tell us that negative feeling or that negative emotion on average only lasts 90 seconds, but it's the stories that we tell around what happened. It's the stories around our negative emotions, the actual context of those negative emotions that we get attached to. And so something that we could have allowed to move through our body in a mere 90 seconds, for many people, they can live with and recursively recreate and relive for years, decades. And that those trauma points become the context of our life. They become the thing that we are in reaction to, and they keep us trapped. You don't want to, for always, for years, be in reaction to something that happened decades ago. Think about how that contorts your entire life. Think about how the context of trauma actually drives all of your decision making. Because you're never going to allow that thing to happen again, so you become hyper vigilant and you start to contort and twist choices in your life around avoiding something as opposed to creating what's possible. So the context that we are creators of around events where we may have had a negative experience and a negative emotion that could have just been a 90-second thing, we relive over and over and over again. And it becomes the defining things in our life. Most people's lives, the context, the operating system of their life, are traumas that they are seeking to assuage and avoid, and they contort themselves and their life in all kinds of twisted ways that are not aligned with creating anything, but rather avoiding the past. So when we speak about context, we're really speaking about that invisible state, again, that operating system that defines your life until you bring it into light and you address it. It's kind of like, well, it's not even kind of like, it is precisely that quote from Carl Jung. who talks about our past and talks about the importance of making the unconscious conscious so that we don't call it fate, so that we don't mistake it for fate. Or as Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The unconscious that he's talking about is the context. Your unconscious mind, your unconscious world includes what happened to you when you were younger, at a younger age, maybe not even a child. But whatever's happened to you in your past that you leave unresolved, that you relive over and over and over again. We love to relive our traumas and our stories, and the trauma doesn't even need to be a profound one. You know, as especially when we're kids, sometimes the stupidest things can become traumatic for us. I tell a story all the time in whole life architecture about when I was younger, and it was my birthday party, and my mother, I wanted Star Wars toys. It was the thing in the early 80s. And for my birthday, and instead my mother got me a board game, and I had a complete temper tantrum and meltdown in front of all of these friends and their parents, and because my friends had got all the Star Wars stuff for their birthday, but I didn't get it for mine. And then I felt so awful about having this temper tantrum in front of my mother and making her feel bad, that I resolved I will never disappoint her again. And that became a story of don't disappoint people. It became the context. It became my underlying operating system. And for 30 years, my whole life orientated around don't disappoint people. Instead of living from my place of power, instead of being the creator of my life, every decision I made subconsciously was driven by not disappointing someone. So think about it. In moments where I would have, say, more connected to my naturalness, I would have just naturally spoke my mind. I contorted my words or said nothing. In places where I would have taken action, bold action, as a form of self-expression, say like in art or music or even in business, instead of being bold with my ideas, I contorted or withheld them to not disappoint. I was always deferential, letting other people get their way. This is just one example of how one thing in your life, this was one event, this was one moment, it was like my 8th birthday party or something. And it wasn't even that traumatic, but to an 8-year-old, what I experienced and went through that night, by having the temper tantrum and then feeling guilt and remorse, and then creating a story about how I was shameful and wrong for having done that, and that became the context that drove decades of my life. So your trauma doesn't have to be objectively awful. It could be subjectively traumatic, even though from the outside looking in, it was just a blip. When I mentioned it to my mother years later, she chuckled and she's like, I don't even remember that happening. And yet for me, it became the story driving my life. So as we move into our meditation, we're in an observer-watcher meditation again this morning. Invite your subconscious to reveal to you what is the context driving your life. What unresolved stories have you been living over and over and over again because you got more addicted to the story than the event itself? The story ended up being imbued with more meaning than what happened had in the first place. And this might not become immediately apparent to you, but just inviting your subconscious to release it will give you an enormous lift and release and an experience of being liberated from a context that has kept you trapped. We all have something like this, and some of us have more serious examples, and some of us have trivial examples like mine. But what I'm trying to articulate this morning is that whether the actual event was truly objectively traumatic or only subjectively traumatic, the thing that traps us is the context we create, which is the story that drives our life. It's what we made it mean about us, or about our life, or about our belief systems. What is the context that you are in reaction to in your life? And maybe you won't find that moment. Maybe you can't remember it. Maybe your brain won't reveal it to you. It's been blocked out. The invitation this morning is to still realize that you are in reaction to a context. That if you look at your life, you can observe things in your life that are out of alignment, and yet you question, why am I doing these things? You're doing these things in reaction to a context that's invisible to you. It's become a blind spot. Even inviting your subconscious to begin to explore that and unlock that and be able to let that go is going to be liberating for you. So as we move into our watcher observer meditation this morning, you are not your thoughts, you are not your emotions, you are just the observer of them, and you are inviting your subconscious mind to provide an insight, to speak to you. Where in my life am I living in reaction to a context that is out of alignment with what makes me turn on and come alive? How am I contorting myself for some invisible thing that isn't even happening anymore? Where can I free myself up? Where can I liberate myself? Simply by bringing awareness to it. Be in a comfortable seat. Take a few cleansing breaths. This is not a guided meditation. You are simply observing your thoughts as though they are clouds drifting in and out of your awareness, and you are feeling your emotions rise and fall like the ocean for the next few minutes. You're just sitting, being in the no-thingness, not actively thinking about anything, not actively feeling anything, allowing what your brain wants to think and your emotions wants to let rise and fall within your body, allowing that to just happen. And they will come and go. Don't chase your thought, don't chase your emotions. If you find yourself getting into planning or overthinking, catch yourself and let it go, and then allow yourself to drop back into the nothingness, the emptiness, the space of just being. There's nothing to do, nothing to think about. And in this state, your subconscious mind may reveal an insight to you of where your life is a reaction to a story, to a context that was something that happened many years ago. Maybe you'll see it, maybe you won't. It's actually not necessary for your liberation, but for those who have the opportunity to see it, all I can tell you from my own experience is it's usually pretty shocking when you realize how we've made mountains out of molehills in our life. Or as that famous Mark Twain quote, my life has been filled with all kinds of awful, tragic events, most of which never happened. The context you're swimming in is defining the contours of your life. Wouldn't it be nice to be the creator of that? as opposed to being a victim of your context. So, for the next few minutes, take a few deep breaths and go within, and I'll see you all on the other side. And welcome back, everybody. Reconnecting to the world without from the world within. Reconnecting to the world of effects from your inner world of creativity. Perhaps you may have got an insight this morning about some event that has become the context that you were in reaction to in your life. Some occurrence that happened in your past that you, in an effort to survive, your brain created an entire story around which you are now avoiding, around which your life has been defined, perhaps for years. And the invitation, if you did get that insight, is to let the story go. If you didn't get the insight, that's fine. You've given your subconscious permission to start looking. It may hit you out of the blue. For me, when I had my realization of the story that I was in reaction to about my birthday party, it came without me even thinking about it. I wasn't in some therapist's office. I wasn't doing any deep work. In fact, I can't even remember the exact moment. I remember the year and the month, but I think I was just going about my day. And I had this flash, this awareness of this memory of this birthday party. And it all clicked into place, but it was because I was giving my higher self permission to look, to not keep it hidden. I invited curiosity into what my operating system was. And then this showed up. So if you didn't get an insight today, you might get one later today, tomorrow, a month from now. Be open to the inquiry. What is the context in which I am in reaction to in my life that has created, that has defined so much of my life? Get curious about those areas in your life that are out of alignment. And just be open. Either way, whether you got some insight today or you're still waiting for yours to show up, you have the power to create the context of your life. And it can be a context of power and possibility, or it can be a context of avoidance, of mitigation, of risk aversion, of playing it safe and playing it small, because of whatever story you come up with. The choice is yours. You get to write the story of your life. And that includes writing a story of you being a victim. But either way, your life is your life. I invite you to choose to liberate yourself and to create a powerful story for your life. I want to wish you all a wonderful day, and we will continue with a meditation, a guided meditation tomorrow.